This channel's for people who don't scare easy. If that's you, hit subscribe, turn the lights down, and get comfortable. What you're about to hear might follow you to sleep. You think the scariest part of a long-haul trip is falling asleep behind the wheel? Think again. Think you've seen it all? Drop your own late-night road encounters in the comments below. Out here, it's not just fatigue or weather you have to worry about. There are stories, real ones, that make drivers fear pulling over, turning off the radio, or even glancing out the window. From apparitions drifting through convoys to auctions where the price is your own soul, the road holds more than just secrets. The question isn't if you'll find something waiting out there. It's how many of these nightmares you'll meet before morning. And for some, the first sign is a glow on the horizon that shouldn't be there at all. They call it the Neon Mirage, a legend that moves quietly among late-night drivers who cross the Mojave's empty miles. It isn't on any map, never appears in the same place twice, and most who claim to see it are dismissed as tired or sunstruck. But for Lena Park, what happened that July night in 2022 was no trick of exhaustion. Lena, who'd spent years hauling refrigerated loads across the Southwest, was used to the monotony and heat. On this particular run, the desert air pressed in heavy and silent. Past midnight, a strange cluster of colors flickered ahead, red, blue, and green pulsing against the sand. Curious but cautious, Lena slowed her rig, expecting maybe a late-night truck stop or rest area. Instead, a fully lit diner materialized, its neon sign, Betty's Oasis, casting a sharp glow on the chrome and glass. The place looked untouched by time, but it was the silence that made Lena pause. The usual night sounds, the insects, the wind, were gone. When she stepped out, the air carried a faint, sour-sweet smell, like something left too long in the sun. Inside, the diner was a perfect slice of the past, checkered floor, red stools, a jukebox humming low. But the details felt wrong. The patrons scattered at the counter and booths wore mid-century clothes and stared blankly into space. Their eyes never quite focused, drifting as if they were lost in thought or memory. Behind the counter, a cook in a spotless apron asked, "Hungry?" His voice was flat, echoing in the stillness. Lena sat down, searching for something familiar, but every detail seemed to push her further from reality. The clock above the counter jerked forward, then spun slowly backward. She tried to take a picture with her phone, but each shot vanished from her gallery. The menu in front of her listed dishes with names that made no sense. Yesterday's wishes, endless roads, and instead of prices, each item demanded something intangible. Time, solitude, a way home. The scent of rot clung to the air, mixing with the stale coffee and sugar. The unease grew until Lena stood to leave, but the moment she stepped outside, the world seemed to fold in on itself. No matter which direction she took, her truck and the neon diner reappeared, always waiting, always unchanged. She circled through the same patch of desert, the same silent parking lot, the same glowing windows. Time lost meaning. The sky began to lighten before Lena finally broke free, her truck back on the empty highway, the diner gone as if it had never been there. She checked her dash cam, hoping for proof, but the footage showed nothing but blacktop and sand. No sign of the neon lights, no tire marks, nothing to explain the lost hours. Later, a mechanic in Barstow told her the story was common enough among drivers. Those who lingered at the Mirage were rarely seen again. The legend warns that the road sometimes conjures its own traps, especially for those who wander too far from the familiar. Lena's story isn't the only one where the road seems to reach out, testing the limits of what drivers can endure. Sometimes it's not a phantom diner, but something more ordinary, nature itself, that signals when something isn't right. In the Texas Panhandle, Hector Ruiz found that some warnings come on wings. April 2019 brought him a dusk thick with dust and the low, humming quiet that settles over empty roads. As he watched the horizon flatten under the weight of a red sun, a strange chill crept through the cab. A sudden drop in temperature that made Hector reach for his jacket. The smell of old hay, mixed with something sour and metallic, seeped in through the vents. He checked his mirrors, expecting nothing but the familiar sprawl of land behind him. Instead, a shifting mass caught his eye. Crows, more than he'd ever seen, pouring from the sky in a black torrent. They didn't just gather. They surrounded his rig, their wings scraping the air with a sound like dry leaves dragged across asphalt. Their cries rose in a harsh, tangled chorus that drowned out the engine. It wasn't the usual cawing. This was urgent, almost pleading. The birds pressed closer, forcing Hector to slow and veer off the main road onto a narrow lane he couldn't remember seeing on any map. The crows seemed to herd him, their numbers thickening above and around, guiding him deeper into the unknown. The lane twisted through scrub and weeds, every window filled with the blur of wings. The air inside the cab felt wrong, thick, heavy, and cold. When Hector finally stopped, the birds scattered, revealing an overturned cattle truck up ahead. Its trailer doors hung open, metal twisted and scorched, the ground beneath marked by a trail of burned hoofprints that led out into the empty field. There was no movement, no sound but the wind, and the crows settling in silent ranks along the fence and wires. Hector stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, the silence pressing in. The air smelled of singed hair and something older, deeper, like earth after a fire. He glanced at the wreck, noticing the cattle inside were gone. No bodies, just the marks they'd left behind. The crows watched, unblinking as if waiting. The radio in his cab, usually a lifeline on these stretches, spat only static. No voices, no music, just a thin hiss that matched the tension in the air. He hurried back to his own trailer, nerves raw. The latch swung open, the inside empty but for a single black feather and a smear of ash. The livestock he'd loaded that afternoon had vanished without a trace. The hoofprints inside were burned into the floor, leading nowhere. Hector tried his phone, but there was no signal. Only a blank screen reflecting his own unease. He drove on, guided by instinct more than reason, the crows thinning as dawn approached. At a truck stop later, he told his story to a circle of older drivers. They listened in silence until one finally spoke. Those birds aren't just birds. Sometimes they come for what's owed. Local talk in the Panhandle says the crows are messengers, reclaiming what's lost or what the road itself demands. Hector never found his cattle, and he never forgot the cold, the smell, or the sound those crows made in the dark. Not every threat on the highway comes with feathers or fire. For some, the danger waits in places that seem routine, a way station's empty lot, a clipboard left on a counter, a deal offered when you least expect it. Nadine D. Walker always kept her stops brief, especially at night. But when a faded sign for a way station appeared where she swore there hadn't been one before, she eased her flatbed onto the shoulder. It was 3 a.m., an hour when the world feels thinner, every sound sharper. The sign's letters flickered, barely legible. Yet as Dee slowed, the whole station lit up, as if expecting her. She pulled in, engine idling in the hush. The building was small, nothing out of the ordinary, but its windows glowed with an unnatural light. As she turned off the ignition, a man in an old-fashioned uniform stepped from the shadows. His cap sat low, brass buttons catching the glow, his movements steady and silent. He didn't speak, only raised a gloved hand and pointed to the door. Dee hesitated, but the strange stillness outside pressed her forward. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of old paper and dust. The room was crowded with figures, men and women in uniforms and dresses from another era, their faces blurred, eyes fixed ahead. No one moved. Dee's footsteps sounded too loud as she took in the scene. At the front, a tall auctioneer stood on a platform, his shadow stretching long beneath the dim lights. His voice, rough and deep, broke the silence. "We've been waiting." A bell rang, and the auction began. Items rolled out, each stranger than the last: a fishing tackle box, a leather jacket, things that looked like they belonged to people long gone. Then came her set of keys. Dee's heart pounded as she spotted her own truck parked beyond the platform, chained and ready for bidding. The auctioneer offered no prices. Instead, he called out bids, years, memories, names, each one echoing through the room. At the end, he slid a manifest toward her, its ink shimmering faintly, and demanded her signature. The crowd leaned forward, faces twisting, as if willing her to agree. Dee felt the pressure of the room, the weight of unseen eyes. Her hands shook. The air grew colder, and the figures seemed to close in. She saw her name already written on the manifest, the ink bleeding into the paper. The auctioneer's gravelly voice pressed her. "Sign." Dee backed away, forcing out a single word. "No." The crowd's faces warped, mouths stretching in silent screams as the lights snapped out. She jolted awake in her truck, headlights cutting through the night. The station was gone, the highway empty. On her dashboard sat a tarnished coin, stamped 1932. Dee knew the stories, how that way station burned down in the 70s, attendants lost in the fire, coins like this sometimes found in the ashes. She left Mississippi before dawn, the coin heavy in her pocket, a warning to keep moving and never look back. Some drivers say the coin means you escaped with your soul intact. Others claim it marks you for the road's next test. Either way, it's not the only sign that a highway can remember who passed through at 3 a.m. Some stories linger because they don't fit into any pattern. Rumors pass between drivers about places that appear only when the road is at its emptiest, structures that flicker into being, then vanish by dawn. While way stations and rest stops are meant to be safe harbors, there are accounts that suggest these familiar landmarks can turn strange, especially when exhaustion blurs the line between routine and warning. One such tale circulates among drivers who cross the open stretches of Wyoming at night. They talk about a way station that doesn't appear on any GPS, a building that looks too old for its surroundings, its sign flickering with a weak bluish light. The paint peels and strips, and rust runs down the walls, as if the place has been left to weather decades of storms no one remembers. There's never a side road leading to it, and those who pull in describe a cold that sinks deep, cutting through layers of clothing and settling in the bones. Inside, the silence is heavy and complete. The only sound is the faint echo of footsteps on cracked linoleum and the hum of fluorescent lights that seem to flicker out of sync with reality. Sometimes a clock on the wall spins in slow, uneven circles, refusing to move forward or back. The air smells of metal and dust. Drivers say they see a figure in a pressed black suit behind the counter. He never speaks, only gestures to a manifest, never a weight ticket, but a list of personal belongings, memories, or years. The prices aren't in dollars or pounds, but in things lost and things owed. At the bottom, a signature line waits, and more than one driver has seen their own name already traced in careful handwriting. The stories agree on one thing: leaving is harder than it should be. The building seems to stretch, the doors grow heavy, and distant voices murmur from behind the walls. The urge to run becomes overwhelming. but the air grows thick and the floor feels soft, almost like it's pulling you in. Only those who resist the urge to sign and force themselves back to their trucks make it out. When the wheels finally hit the highway, the station fades away, swallowed by the darkness behind them. What remains is almost always the same. A coin left behind on the dashboard or seat, stamped with a year no one can quite place. Some keep the coin as a warning, others toss it out the window at the next stop, hoping to leave the memory behind. The lesson drivers repeat is simple. Not every stop on the highway is meant for you, and some places keep a tally of who passes through and what they're willing to give up. But the road's warnings don't always take the form of buildings or strangers. Sometimes they hide in open fields and empty stretches, watching from the edges as headlights cut through the night. Under the harvest moon, Nebraska's fields looked endless, rows of corn stretching in every direction, the land washed in a cold, silvery light that left no room for shadows. Emma Collins, a rookie hauling her first solo tanker load, felt the weight of that openness as she guided her rig down a narrow road. The air was still, every sound from the truck amplified in the quiet. What should have been a peaceful run instead pressed in on her, the emptiness sharpening her awareness of every detail outside the glass. It started with the scarecrows. In the moonlight, their shapes broke up the neat lines of corn, each figure hunched and ragged, arms outstretched as if holding back the night. At first, Emma counted them as part of the scenery, but then she noticed something off. As her headlights swept past, the scarecrows' heads turned in unison, button eyes catching the light and reflecting it back at her. The movement was too smooth, too deliberate. Emma's hands tightened on the wheel. She glanced in the mirrors, but the fields behind her looked empty again. The scarecrows grew more frequent as she went on, some leaning forward, others twisted at odd angles, all of them facing the road. Then, just beyond the reach of her high beams, Emma saw a child standing among them. The figure was still, small and pale, one arm raised in a slow, unmistakable wave. Her instincts screamed to keep driving, but something about the child held her attention. She pulled over, gravel crunching under her tires, and stepped out into the night. The wind carried a faint rustle from the corn. Emma called out, her voice sounding thin. The child didn't move or answer. As she hesitated, a wet, dragging sound came from behind her. She turned and saw muddy handprints smeared along the sides of her trailer, fresh, the mud glistening in the moonlight. The prints were uneven, some small, some impossibly large, running the length of the tank. Emma backed away, heart pounding, the child's arm still raised in that slow wave, the scarecrows standing silent and watchful. She scrambled back into the cab, locking the doors with shaking hands, and drove without stopping until the lights of a truck stop broke the darkness. Only inside, surrounded by the noise and fluorescent glare, did she notice something resting on her dashboard. A crude doll made of corn husks tied with red thread, and a slip of paper tucked beneath it. The note read, in a shaky hand, "Safe passage granted this time. Don't stop again." Emma keeps the doll now, a warning she wishes she could forget. At the counter, old-timers spoke in low voices. "Never stop for the scarecrow, child," one told her, the words less a warning than a law. It's a rule passed quietly among drivers, a superstition with the weight of experience behind it. They say the scarecrows are more than guardians of the fields. They're judges, watching for those who stray from the road's unspoken rules. The lesson stays with Emma, and with anyone who's heard her story. Out here, even the most ordinary landscapes can turn strange, and sometimes the road remembers those who pass through. For others, it's not the fields, but the sound of something old, a bell, a voice, a memory, that signals when the past isn't as distant as it seems. Jacek Nowak was a car hauler who trusted the road's routines. He liked the comfort of repetition, mile after mile of steady lines, the engine's low rumble, the world reduced to what his headlights touched. But on a cold night in Pennsylvania, the road offered something different. At 2 a.m., the silence inside his cab felt absolute, the kind that makes you aware of every breath. Out of that quiet came the sound of a bell, distant at first, then swelling until it seemed to fill the truck. He thought it must be a trick of the mind. There were no churches out here, just frost-bitten fields and rows of skeletal trees. Still, the bell kept tolling, the sound not just heard, but felt, vibrating through the frame of his rig, humming in the steel beneath his hands. Jacek reached for the radio, hoping for distraction, but the dial spun with no effect. Only static, then nothing. The bell's next toll sent a shiver through the mirrors. Each time it rang, the glass clouded over, erasing the world behind him. Jacek's GPS, usually steady, flickered and stuttered. The familiar green line dissolved, rerouting him without warning onto a road that didn't match any map. He hesitated, but the screen insisted, and the bell's echo pressed him forward. The highway narrowed, asphalt giving way to gravel, the edges lost in fog that seemed to thicken with every toll. His side mirrors stayed fogged, and even the windshield began to streak, though the sky was clear. He followed the new route, nerves tight, until the headlights caught a line of figures along the roadside. At first, they looked like fence posts in the mist, but as he drew closer, the details sharpened. Dozens of people stood in a row, backs to the road, hands clasped in front of them. Their clothes were old, suits, dresses, Sunday best faded by time. They stood motionless, faces hidden, the bell's echo lingering over them. Jacek slowed almost to a stop, watching as the figures kept their silent vigil. The air inside the cab grew heavy, thick with the sense of being watched. The bell tolled one last time, louder than before. Then, suddenly, the sound cut off. The road straightened, the fog thinned, and the congregation vanished into the dark. For a moment, everything was still. Jacek let out a breath, thinking the worst had passed. Then he noticed something on the passenger seat, a slip of yellowed paper, brittle at the edges. He picked it up with shaking fingers. It was a church bulletin, dated November 12th, 1911. The name matched a ruined church he'd seen years ago, its stone walls half sunken in weeds along a forgotten stretch. At the bottom, in faded print, "All are welcome to join our eternal congregation." He dropped the bulletin and drove on, the memory of the bells following him long after the road returned to normal. Some drivers say the old churches out here never truly empty, and that the bells ring for those the road won't let go. In places like this, the past finds ways to linger, sometimes in the shape of a ruined building, sometimes in the echo of something that refuses to be forgotten. There are stretches of highway where the landscape itself seems to hold its breath, and the line between the living and the lost grows thin. Marisol Vega's story begins on a spring night in the Louisiana bayou, where the road narrows to a causeway and the water presses in from all sides. She had driven these routes for years, learning to trust the hum of her engine and the faint glow of her headlights as they cut through the mist. The air was thick with humidity, the sky still restless from a recent storm, and the black water on either side seemed to swallow any sound that drifted from the cab. As she guided her truck along the slick, uneven pavement, Marisol noticed something unusual on the horizon, points of gold and orange light, too steady to be reflections. She slowed, eyes narrowing. The lights resolved into lanterns, each one swinging gently as if carried by unseen hands. Then, out of the haze, figures began to appear. They moved in a single line along the flooded edge of the road, bodies indistinct, their faces featureless and pale. Each held a lantern, their procession silent except for the soft clink of glass and the hush of water lapping at the causeway. Marisol's pulse quickened. Instinct told her to keep moving, not to meet their gaze. As she drew closer, her radio crackled. The static gave way to a slow, mournful hymn, an old melody that sounded as if it were being sung underwater. The voices stretched and distant. The hymn grew louder as she approached the lantern-bearers, the sound pressing in on her from all sides. She glanced at her dashboard and saw the temperature gauge plunge into the red, the needle trembling as if caught in a sudden freeze. Frost began to form along the edges of her windshield, a thin, crystalline layer that made no sense in the muggy Louisiana night. The unnatural chill seeped into her bones, and her breath fogged in the air. The truck rolled past the last figure. The lights vanished at once, swallowed by the mist. The hymn faded, leaving only the sound of tires on wet asphalt and the rush of her own heartbeat. Marisol realized she had been holding her breath, her hands tight on the wheel. She didn't stop until she reached a levee road outside a small town. The air felt warmer as she stepped out, but the sense of unreality lingered. Without knowing why, she retrieved a camping lantern from her cab, lit it, and set it by the water's edge. A gesture that felt necessary, a way to honor what she had seen. At a coffee shop the next morning, Marisol recounted her experience to an older man who listened without interruption. When she finished, he nodded. "Those are the souls lost in the hurricane of 2027, he told her, still searching for land that isn't there. Marisol didn't argue. The details, the cold, the hymn, the faceless procession, were too vivid to dismiss. She left the bayou behind, but the memory stayed. Now, whenever she travels those quiet roads, she checks her mirrors for a flicker of lantern light, the hymn echoing faintly in her mind. Some drivers find their warnings in the water and the fog. Others, like the next story, discover that even the most familiar stretches of forest can hide reminders of the sea, and the road's boundaries are never as solid as they seem. Owen McBride knew the logging roads of British Columbia better than most. He trusted the steady hush of snow against the windshield and the way the forest pressed in, silent and endless. That winter night, the woods felt heavier, every mile marked by the soft crunch of snow and the fog that clung low between the pines. The isolation, usually a comfort, took on a different weight as the world outside his cab seemed to hold its breath. The first sign that something was wrong came from his CB radio. Owen left it on low, a background murmur to keep the loneliness at bay. But as he wound through a narrow stretch, the usual static faded. In its place, a melody crept through, clear and deliberate. The old sea shanty, heave away, haul away. The tune didn't belong here, not in the heart of the woods, not miles from the nearest coast. The voices sounded distant, layered under the hiss of static, each verse rising and falling as if sung by men who'd never seen these forests. Owen tried to tune it out, but the song persisted, threading through the cab, making the hair on his arms stand up. The fog thickened, swallowing the headlights. Then through the grey a shape moved, tall and sharp against the blur of trees. Owen slowed, squinting into the gloom. What emerged was impossible. A schooner, sails full, gliding through the timber as if the forest were an open sea. Its hull cut through snowbanks, leaving no trace. Lanterns swung from the rigging, casting pale light on the deck. Figures moved aboard, silent and shadowed, their faces lost to distance. One raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave as the truck passed. The gesture wasn't threatening, but it pressed a chill deep into Owen's chest. He forced his eyes back to the road, hands tight on the wheel. Something tugged at his attention, a flicker on the dashboard. The odometer, which should have ticked up by tenths of a mile, had jumped by exactly 1 nautical mile. The number glowed back at him, unblinking. Owen's mind raced to make sense of it, but nothing fit. The forest felt altered, the air thick with salt and something older than the trees. He drove on, the song fading as the schooner slipped into the mist. When he finally reached a service station, Owen checked his trailer, half expecting to find it empty. Instead, he found a barnacle-encrusted anchor wedged in the shadows, the iron slick and cold, seawater pooling beneath it. He'd never seen it before. The anchor's presence made the encounter feel real in a way the radio and the ship could not. Owen hauled the anchor out and left it on the roadside, not daring to look back. The fog lifted as he pulled away, the radio silent once more. He kept driving, but the forest felt changed, like he'd crossed into a place where the rules of the road were different, where time and distance could slip sideways without warning. Some drivers say there are miles where the world runs on a different set of gears, and what you meet there might follow you long after you've left the woods behind. John Owen spent most nights on the highway with only the hum of his engine and the soft pulse of synth music for company. Indiana's empty roads rarely offered surprises, but one March night, routine gave way to something he'd never experienced before. Just past midnight, the darkness felt heavier than usual, and shadows flickered at the edge of his headlights. There were no trees to cast them, only the open stretch ahead. Then, a faint metallic clicking reached him. Steady, measured, and nothing like the usual sounds of the road. He eased off the gas as the noise grew louder. Out of the fog, a convoy emerged. At first, John thought it was a line of trucks, but as they drew closer, details snapped into focus that made his hands clench the wheel. Their bodies were built from polished brass, gears exposed and spinning in perfect rhythm. Gas lamp headlights cut through the mist, casting a golden light that shimmered across the asphalt. Each truck moved in flawless formation, and the air filled with the quiet, relentless ticking of unseen clocks. The lead truck pulled alongside John's rig. Inside, the driver wasn't quite human. His face was smooth brass, and where his eyes should have been, 2 clock hands spun in opposite directions, ticking out the seconds. When he smiled, the gears in his cheeks turned, producing a faint whirring that made John's skin crawl. The convoy's presence pressed in on the cab, and the world outside seemed to slow. John's dashboard blinked, the numbers replaced by Roman numerals. His speedometer spun wildly, then settled on a number measured in fathoms, not miles. The GPS map twisted into a spiral, roots looping back on themselves in impossible patterns. A hiss of static burst from the radio, layered with the grind of cogs and something that almost sounded like words. John stared ahead, frozen, as the convoy moved past. The ticking grew louder, then suddenly faded as the trucks turned onto a side road swallowed by mist. The dashboard lights steadied, the GPS untangled. The road ahead was empty, as if nothing had happened. The next morning, John scrolled through his phone, trying to convince himself it was just exhaustion. But in his photo gallery, he found a schematic he didn't remember taking, a truck engine drawn in precise lines, stamped with the year 1899, and signed the horologist. The image felt old and out of place, but it was there, clear as any photograph. After that night, odd things started happening. Clocks in his house ran backward. Emails arrived with dates from over a century ago. Sometimes, when the world was quiet, he heard faint metallic ticking, just at the edge of hearing. John never saw the clockwork convoy again, but the memory lingers. The rules of the road seemed to shift after that, and he couldn't shake the sense that he'd been marked. Some nights, when the fog rolls in and the highway empties, he wonders if the convoy will return, if there are other forces out there, waiting for the right moment to remind drivers that not everything on the road belongs to the present. There are places where the land itself seems to hold a memory, where the ordinary turns strange and the familiar grows watchful. Mark Brooks always thought of the northern Georgia pines as steady companions. On late-night tanker runs, those trees lined the back roads like sentinels, familiar and unchanging. He called them old friends. But one humid July night, the forest's welcome slipped away. The air turned thick, heavy enough to slow each breath. The familiar chorus of crickets and frogs faded until only the hum of his engine remained. It wasn't just quiet, it was a hush, the kind that signals something watching. As Mark rounded a bend, he noticed the pines looming taller, their trunks swaying though the air felt still. The scent in the cab shifted, sharp and medicinal, cutting through the usual damp earth. That's when he heard it. His name, whispered low and clear. At first it sounded like a memory, a trick of fatigue. But the voice came again, then again, until it gathered into a chorus that seemed to move with the trees, weaving through the branches and into the cab. Mark slowed, peering into the darkness beyond the headlights. Movement along the roadside caught his eye. Faces began to form in the bark, some peaceful, eyes closed as if dreaming, others twisted in pain, mouths frozen mid-cry. Amber sap oozed from the eyes and lips, catching the moonlight in wet streaks. The forest felt alive, not just with sound but with intent, the weight of every gaze pressing against the glass. Mark reached for his logbook, tossed beside him on the seat. Before he could touch it, the pen jerked upright and began to write, scratching deep lines across the page. The handwriting wasn't his. The words came fast, uneven. Turn back. They remember. You are not alone. The pen paused, then wrote a final line. You are remembered. The warnings felt urgent, a message from something old and restless in the trees. He snapped the book shut and shifted into gear, but the forest pressed closer. Branches scraped along the tanker's sides, the sound sharp and deliberate. The pines seemed to lean inward, narrowing the road, their forms bending as if to block his escape. The whispers rose, a fevered chorus that filled the cab and rattled the glass. Mark pressed the pedal down, forcing the truck forward as the trees clawed at the metal, their shadows stretching across the headlights. He didn't stop until the forest broke, and the road opened up to empty fields. At the first rest stop, Mark stepped out, heart pounding. Something small rolled from the trailer and landed at his feet. A pine cone, carved with careful precision. Etched into its surface in the same unfamiliar hand as his logbook were the words, "You are remembered." Mark never found an answer for what happened in those woods. The pines, once comfort, became a warning. He keeps the pine cone as a reminder that some places hold on to those who pass through, and that not every secret stays buried in the trees. Stories like Mark's are why some drivers never let their guard down, even on the most familiar roads. Every mile of highway holds more than just stories. They are records of loss, fear, and the unseen things that travel alongside us. These 10-trucker nightmares hint that the road is not just a path, but a witness, carrying the weight of every journey and every secret left behind. The highways remember, and sometimes they answer back. If you've had your own chilling encounter, share it in the comments, because the road is always listening. For more verified tales of haunted highways, subscribe and share this video with anyone who finds comfort in the strange and the unexplained.